Good morning, everyone. My name is Tracy Erickson. I'm the SDSU Extension Dairy Field Specialist, and I'd like to welcome everyone here today to our program for the I29 University Winter Workshop, along with the Midwest Dairy and State Trade Association. Again, some opening comments here. We're going to remind all participants that if you could utilize the same name as what you registered with so we can assign you to the appropriate breakout rooms. And if you're curious how to check that, if you put your mouse on your picture up where it has the mute button, there's the three little blue dots in the corner there. If you click on that, and a box will open up and it says rename. So if you need to rename and make sure that you have the same name that everybody registered with, that will help us assign you appropriately to the right breakout rooms. Okay. So once again, my name is Tracy Erickson, SDSU Extension Dairy Field Specialist and member of the I29 MU University collaboration. The I29 MU University is a consortium of extension dairy specialists from the land-grant universities in Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, North Dakota, and South Dakota. The I29 MU University collaboration is a multi-state learning community and connects extension dairy staff and dairy producers to share research and information and management practices through workshops, webinars, monthly e-newsletters, and on-farm tours. For more information about the I29 MU University collaboration and programs, please visit our webpage at dairy.unl.edu/I-29-MU-University. We'd also like to thank our sponsors here that help make these programs possible. Our gold level sponsor is DTE Biomass Energy. Silver sponsors are Seal Pro, Central Plains Dairy Foundation, Diamond V, Filio, LeSafer, Animal Care, AgriPure, and Select Sires. Bronze level sponsors are Cross & Cross, Lollymond, AgriKing, Quality Liquid Feeds, Sioux Nation Ag Center, Mustang Seeds, Pro Ag Engineering, DCC Waterbeds, Nebraska State Dairy Association, Transova Genetics, Alpha Rex Seeds, South Dakota Dairy Producers, Automated Waste Systems, Ag Country, Farm Credit Services, Nutrient Advisors, Western Iowa Dairy Alliance, and Minnesota Milk Producers. I'd like to introduce our first speakers here today. First, we have Krysta Harden. She serves as the Executive Vice President of Global Environmental Strategy for Dairy Management Incorporated, which manages the National Dairy Checkoff on behalf of nearly 37,000 U.S. dairy farmers. In May of 2020, Krysta was named Chief Operating Officer of the U.S. Dairy Export Council. Harden plays a key leadership role in defining the vision, strategy, and plan forward for the U.S. dairy environmental commitment, collaborating with dairy farmers and leadership within the dairy community. Harden will continue to identify the science, best practices, and metrics that will further advance the positive impact U.S. dairy has on the environment and the important role it plays in a sustainable food system. Before DMI, Harden served 3 years as Senior Vice President, External Affairs, and Chief Sustainability Officer for Corteva Agriscience, the agricultural division of DuPont. She also spent 3 years as DuPont Vice President and Vice President of Public Policy and Chief Sustainability Officer. Harden spent 7 years in the U.S. Department of Agriculture under USDA, where she was the Deputy Secretary. She also was Chief of Staff to Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack and was Assistant Secretary for Congressional Relations. And if we could have you start uploading your PowerPoint, Kelly, for Jim and Krysta. I'm going to introduce Jim Wallace now. Jim Wallace holds the position of Senior Vice President, Environmental Research at DMI. He is responsible for leading strategy and oversight of the environmental science and research program to position U.S. dairy in global food systems. And he leads the foundational work for environmental research and measurement to inform decisions, update models, and advance outcomes for the dairy industry's net zero initiative. Prior to joining DMI, Jim was the Senior Vice President of Engineering and Ag Business Development for Nutrient LLC, where he was responsible for developing and leading new technology and project initiatives, supporting environmental market-based development efforts, and led the technical phase of the dairy industry's net zero initiative. Jim holds a BS in Chemical Engineering from Purdue University, a MS in Environmental Engineering from Wayne State University, and a PhD in Biosystems and Agricultural Engineering from Michigan State University. He is also adjunct faculty in Michigan State University's Department of Biosystems and Agricultural Engineering. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Krysta and Jim, and they're going to start it off with our first presentation, focusing on net zero. If it's not your profitability, what is it? So take it away.
Okay, Tracy, thank you. And I appreciate those introductions for Jim and myself. And I'm going to kick things off and then turn it to Jim for the heavy lift, because he is the person who, as his bio stated, is leading some of the foundational research and science that's going to help us as an industry get to net zero. But I want to start with, before we get into the net zero, the whys, the why nots, the what it means, the myths, the facts. It's really thinking about why we're even beginning this journey. Why does this matter to the dairy industry? And you see some numbers here that I think are pretty compelling to talk about our ultimate customer, the consumer, what they're expecting from agriculture, what they're expecting from all of us who are producing food and beverage for them, the kind of things they are looking at. And these numbers, I think, really do tell a very compelling story about what we need to be thinking about as well. When you look at 85% of consumers expect companies to invest in sustainability next year. 81% of global consumers say it's very or extremely important that companies implement programs to help the environment. And so what happens is these companies who are providing products to consumers, food products, is they look back at their source. They want to make sure they know how they're sourcing, and farmers and producers' commitment to sustainability as well. They feel the pressure from the consumer, and the first thing they do is start looking at their sources. Next slide, Kelly, please. Here's just a little bit of a breakdown of where our millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, whatever the next label is, what they are really putting their money towards. And, just keep in mind, this is, someone said to me, oh, it's just a bunch of crazy kids. Well, they're not. I hate to tell you, they're not. Not only are they not just kids, they are the consumers of today and the future. They're the decision makers, they're the office holders, they're the parents who are building into their lifestyle a more sustainable footprint in their minds. They want to make wiser decisions. They want to make decisions that are informed. They look at things like packaging. They look at production commitments. They look at many of the issues that we are facing in our industry, and they're building them into their purchasing decisions. They're building them into their lifestyle. They're making decisions today that truly will impact the future of food and agriculture. It was before that way, before COVID. And what we are learning is COVID has only enhanced that thinking about some of these very critical issues like climate change, or about water, nutrient management, all the issues that impact us in agriculture. So if you look at these numbers, I think there are things that help you recognize why we have to be diligent. We have to start defining ourselves. We have to start talking about who we are as U.S. Dairy and our commitment. Next slide, please, Kelly. I do a lot in my U.S. Dairy Export Council role, looking beyond our borders. But I think all of us have to. It's not just about exports. It's about these companies who also do business in the U.S. You see some global brands there that are very critical to U.S. You see those who are making investments in these brands, and that top group of investors. You look at our competitors around the world and what the commitments they're making to sustainability. And you also look at what's happening in other countries and the demands that countries are putting on all of their local businesses, the multinational businesses that are located there and do business in their countries. So these are household names. These are not the fringe group. These are brands that you know that we all use, and they are coming to us talking about how can we work together with U.S. Dairy to make sure not only are we keeping up with everyone, but in my mind, we will be leading in a number of these sustainability standards and goals for the future. Next slide, please. This leads us to really thinking about dairy as an environmental solution, really not being a problem. Looking at dairy is how do we answer these questions that consumers are asking? How do we make sure they think of dairy as a positive partner, as an industry that has come together to recognize the significant and valuable role we can play and using our natural resources wisely. Just over a year ago, the Innovation Center, which is an organization, there's no membership dues. It's just a kind of a coalition of those involved in dairy that come together to talk about critical issues. It's at the CEO level, it's processors and cooperatives, it's DMI, it's others that really sit around a table a couple of times a year to say, how do we come together as an industry to tackle major problems and questions? How do we stay ahead of some of the most important trends impacting our industry? And the CEOs themselves, decided after months and months and months, even years of research collection and data collection and talking with farmers and being on farms, talking about profitability, talking about the future. So we've got to set some goals. We've got to show the world that we are committed to being that environmental solution, that we are joining arms, linking our resources to try to help make sure farmers can stay on the land and that they can be successful in doing so. So they set three pretty significant goals to become carbon neutral or better, to optimize water use while maximizing recycling, and improving water quality by optimizing our nutrients and manure. So these are the kind of overriding goals set for 2050. That is a long runway, I agree. That gives us time to do the science, to do the research, to pencil it out, to make sure it makes sense for farmers and processors. These questions are huge on how we're going to do this. And we do need that longer runway to figure it out. Now, something that we'll get there before 2050, and if I was a betting girl, I'd bet we would too, but we don't know that. So I think the bright minds in our industry said, let's give us some time to figure this out so we can do it right. You're going to hear a lot more from Jim talk about the net zero initiative. That's the own farm, that's field and farm of getting to the areas of feed production, cow care, energy efficiency, and manure management. Making sure it's economically and viable as well as environmentally positive for our farmers. So Jim's going to walk through net zero, but the processors also know they're on the hook as well. And we have a processor working group that is formed with the processors themselves. It's about 50 participants coming from 30 processing organizations. They work regularly to look at facility-focused work streams, waste, water, packaging, other emissions. So we'll have two really equal dual tracks that are working together, but also independently to answer these questions. Our Net Zero Initiative and our Processor Working Group, both are ongoing today. Next slide, please. Here are the keys to success, and I think this is where I turn it to Jim to make sure he can walk through. But before I leave it to Jim, I do want to make sure that everyone recognizes and understands that it has to make sense for farmers. We have to, be economically viable for farmers. This is about helping them stay on the land. I emphasize that over and over. Also, there are research and data gaps, which I know that Jim is going to walk through. And it's also about scale. We got to make sure that this works for everybody. Now, that does not mean, and we'll stress this many times, and Jim will as well, so you'll hear us repeat ourselves because it's important that all of you recognize what this is and what it's not. This is not about every single farm getting to net zero. Many will over time, but everybody can contribute. Some will contribute more, and some will contribute what they can. And that's what this is about, is making sure that you have access to all the technologies, all the practices, so you as dairy farmers can sit down on your dairy, each of your own farms, around your kitchen table, around your office, to talk about what this means. So please make sure that you listen closely to Jim as he goes through some of the specifics on what we need to do and the partners we need to help get this done. So Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Krysta, and good morning to everybody. And again, just to remind everybody, I'm going to really focus on the NZI field to farm gate piece of the initiative. Starting with the keys to success here, which are really about tackling affordability, addressing data and research gaps, leading to accessibility for farms of all sizes. So we talk a lot about farmers and their adoption of sustainable practices and technology, but we think it's also really important to articulate that we're very focused on how sustainability can work for the farmer. To be successful, farmers require economically viable practices and technologies. And innovation is really a key piece of this. So things like developing non-traditional revenue streams for new manure-based products and for ecosystem services. Those are focal points of the NZI effort to drive affordability for again, farms of all sizes. And in support of innovation and new market opportunities, we are actively addressing and taking on some of these critical research and data gaps with the ultimate vision of creating accessibility of those practices and those technologies for adoption by farms of all sizes. So we can go to the next slide, please. NZI Field to Farm Gate is structured into 3 tracks or pillars. The first is groundwork. And as a working definition, groundwork represents all of the foundational science needed to support things like the economic, environmental, and measurement elements of the initiative. And very importantly, it feeds into and supports the other 2 pillars. So groundwork is going to focus on and does focus on the 4 on-farm environmental prints. And I'll talk a bit more about these on-farm environmental prints in the next slide, but they're enteric, manure, on-farm energy and feed production, and collectively they add up to the total carbon footprint of a dairy. And then within each of these environmental prints, we are in various stages of building out programs, again, that support the other 2 pillars of this initiative, which are Dairy Scale for Good and collective impact. So moving kind of around the dial to Dairy Scale for Good. This is a really unique and I think fascinating program within NZI. It's being led by Caleb Harper, and this pillar is focused on developing partnerships with 3 to 5 dairy farms that will prove the economic viability of a full suite of practices and technologies. So it's putting together in real time and sort of like a living lab, all of those technologies and practices necessary to take a dairy all the way to net zero carbon and perhaps even beyond, with significant improvements in water quantity use and water quality. Another goal of the Dairy Scale for Good effort will be to better understand and begin the process of establishing new market-based approaches for reaching net zero emissions while also increasing farmer livelihood. So currently, Caleb is working with DMI Farmer Relations and with state and regionals. He's visiting farms to learn about and identify the right partners. So those partners who have the scale, and the capability to make a significant investment in this effort for the benefit of the broader industry. And then finally, I want to touch on collective impact. So as we've talked to different audiences and farmers about this work, we know it's important to emphasize that the goals are collective. They're not all farms doing everything, but rather thinking that every farm can do something. And another key point is that NZI has benefits and outcomes that will positively influence farms of all sizes. So what happens on a small number of pilot farms under Dairy Scale for Good will have benefits for the whole industry. What we learn from Dairy Scale for Good and from the market development effort that is a part of Dairy Scale for Good will have applicability to the entire industry. Maybe not immediately, but definitely over time. And so on the dairy, or on the collective impact piece, that's led by Karen Scanlon. It will provide the infrastructure through which we will make information available, disseminate information, get it in the hands of advisors and farmers and farm organizations so that farms of all sizes have access to this information. And at a high level, collective impact is really about scaling up the application and adoption of practices. And it's a primary path for moving learnings from groundwork and from Dairy Scale for Good more broadly to dairies of all sizes. So these three tracks represent a comprehensive and what we hope is a very thoughtful plan to support farms of all sizes in doing what is right for their farms. The work under these pillars will be simultaneous, and there'll be collaborative sharing and learning of information, which is central to making this initiative stronger and leading to more valuable outcomes. Today, research is being initiated, partners are being selected, economic models are being designed, and the community of practice is being established. So with that, let's move to the next slide. So this is a simple schematic, and it's intended to illustrate the connectivity of the four basic environmental prints that I mentioned just a moment ago: feed production, enteric methane, manure, and on-farm energy, and to offer some of the strategies. Some are near term, some are now, some are further out as we develop out and support the research for those programs, but they're all built around driving the dairy toward net zero, and again, with an emphasis on dairies of all sizes. And then just as general background, in recognizing it's difficult to make absolute statements due to variation by region and farm size and management style. But on average, and just to sort of kind of level set on this, the manure print represents about 35% of the farm's environmental GHG footprint, enteric about 35%, feed production about 25%, and the balance, which is 5%, my math is correct, is on-farm energy. So talking through the slide, starting on the upper left-hand corner with the feed production piece, here we're thinking about things like minimal disturbance tillage in cover cropping, innovative crop rotations, and new manure-based fertilizer products, all built around reducing the farm's GHG profile. And this really is focused in many cases on practices that farmers are already doing, and we're seeking ways to both quantify and monetize the environmental impact of those practices. And actually in the next series of slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about a grant program that we are initiating this month through Foundation for Food and Ag Research that seeks to quantify that dairy feed production piece. So more to come in the next slide. But continuing on to the right, under the cow care and efficiency piece, this is all about enteric methane. And here we're thinking about strategies that can be very basic and straightforward, things like feed reformulation. So really just basic concepts, strategies, focusing on things like high quality rations, opportunities in areas like feed additives and feed supplements. So there are a number of products, I'm sure many of you are familiar with them, that are making their way toward being market ready, that are focused on enteric reductions. And that represents a really exciting area for us because it is an opportunity for a step change reduction in a really challenging piece of the net zero puzzle, that being the enteric methane component. Other areas that we're contemplating here are things like selective breeding, so producing more desirable traits. And I think a great example is that in December, Council for Dairy Cattle Breeding put forward a new trait called Feed Saved. And that trait ultimately will provide a higher level of feed efficiency, so the same amount of milk produced for less feed input. So those are the types of things on the breeding side that I think are interesting, and it's not too far in the future, I fully expect, where we'll see innovations that relate to breeding and lower methane emitting cows. And then finally, technology. In just real simple terms here, what we're really kind of getting at with this element is seeking to move the farm toward management at more of the single cow level to improve overall farm profitability and further reduce and impact our GHG footprint. Continuing on to the right, the on-farm energy practice piece. Here we're including many of the practices that farms are already doing. So things like LED lighting, VFDs, high efficiency refrigeration. We're also exploring new opportunities in certain regions, such as renewable energy from wind and solar. And of course, we're looking at conversion of biogas into electricity or renewable gas through anaerobic digestion. And I recognize that most people will argue that this is a large farm-only technology. And today, I think that's fairly true. But as we progress forward with the net zero program, there's no doubt in my mind that through adoption, through scale, we will see the farm size that benefits from technologies like anaerobic digestion significantly reduced and impact farms of smaller and smaller size. And then lastly, bottom left, manure management piece. Here, the approach could be as simple as nutrient management plans, all the way through to nutrient separation technologies that really span the spectrum from simple solid liquid separation to really high-end technologies like evaporative technologies that produce sort of segregated and concentrated products that are starting to look a lot more like commercial fertilizer products. They can be stored, they can be transported, and they can be placed where and when they're needed. So final comment on this slide, and that is that since NZI's inception, we've recognized and are working to reserve the farmer's right to revenue generated on farm that in many cases hasn't been necessarily perceived or viewed as a value or a resource, and we're seeking that out as new revenue opportunities. And with that, we could move to the next slide. So here, this is the feed production grant that I just want to touch on briefly. I have 3 brief slides on this. It's titled Improving Dairy On-Farm Sustainability Through Improved Soil Health and Manure Management. Just a really quick background on this. When NZI work was started in earnest about 2 years ago, one of the first steps was to understand where the critical research and knowledge gaps were at. And there are many. However, one of the first that we chose to focus on is feed production. That's what this grant is all about. And I'll acknowledge that feed production is not the most significant. I pointed out that it's roughly 25%. Both methane and enteric are greater contributors. But we think it offers a really important area of opportunity for the dairy farm. One, we just don't have a lot of data that speaks to what our feed production footprint actually is on farm. So that's a key piece. And the second is that we think there are some really tremendous opportunities from a carbon sequestration perspective, as well as from a water quality perspective for creating new opportunities for revenue sources on farm. One other comment on this slide, and that is it's a 6-year program. There are 5 growing seasons. Foundation for Food and Ag Research is putting $10 million toward this. We're just formalizing the final budget now. It's probably going to end up in that $23.5 million or so range. The balance of the match will be provided by external sources through fundraising efforts that we're currently engaged. One other thing on this slide before we move on, and that is that there are 8 farms in each of the major dairy regions and 8 research institutions that are participating in this grant program. And with that, we could move to the next slide, please. So this is a sort of a map. It's intended to really kind of show the breadth and the scope of this program. We've divided the country into 4 regions: Northeast, Lake States, Mountain Region, and California. Within each of those 4 regions, we're partnering with, again, 8 farms. Those farms are 5 operating dairies, 2 university research dairies, and 1 ARS research farm. We have 8 key research partners, including Soil Health Institute. And Soil Health Institute is working across all regions with us. And then within the regions, Cornell University, University of Vermont, UW-Madison, UW-Platteville, Texas A&M, UC Davis, and ARS Kimberly, Idaho. And within each of those regions, we're executing a combination of large plot and field scale work with water quality and quantity elements in each of those regions. And then lastly, let's move to the next slide. At a high level, this grant program will assess the impact of minimal disturbance tillage, cover cropping, innovative crop rotations, and new manure-based products on 3 kind of key focus areas: soil carbon sequestration, agronomic and environmental outcomes, and soil health. And I think it would be fair to say that soil carbon sequestration clearly fits under soil health, but we feel that it's such an important piece that we've pulled it out separately and are really focusing on that as a sort of a standalone deliverable for this grant program. And then under soil health, that piece is really important to us. We're building on an existing program that's currently being executed by TNC, Soil Health Institute, and the FAR program, looking at 31 soil health indices across the US. We're seeking to distill that down into 4 to 6 that can really impact and make a positive difference for agriculture as a part of this grant program. And then kind of final comments, overall goal is to provide the scientific support for measuring our feed production footprint. That's one key takeaway. The second key takeaway is we're really going to set the stage for new market opportunities related to carbon and water quality. And with that, let's move to the next slide, please. So we've covered a lot of what NZI will do, but I do want to reinforce again that the outcomes are for dairy farms of all sizes. Overall, this initiative will bring credible science and improved data for decision making. It will bring market-based opportunities and new products and set the stage for economic viability and new revenue sourcing. In the case of Dairy Scale for Good, 3 to 5 partner farms, as I outlined previously, and then finally under the collective impact piece, really a pathway for moving at scale these learnings to farms of all sizes and advancing the net zero initiative. So with that, Krysta, I'd like to pass it back over to you.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate it, and really appreciate the level of detail you provided, because I know there is a lot of information here, and we're going to be around for a couple of questions as well. I just want to go back with basically almost where I started, because I think it's very important for all of you to understand what NZI is and what it's not. And it is a collective of all farms. Again, it's not every single farm reaching net zero, although many will, but not everybody. But everybody can contribute something. When we first introduced net zero concepts or one of the first times to the DMI board, I just started with asking everyone to look at a list of farm practices and technologies, just a random list, to see if anybody was doing any of those already. Every single hand went up. Not on every single practice or technology, but they were doing something. And that's exactly the message we want to send, that this is a collective effort on all farms. And it's not mandatory. This is a voluntary effort. You've got to decide as farmers yourself what makes sense for your own operation. I've certainly learned there are no 2 farms, neighbor to neighbor, sibling to sibling. They're exactly alike. So you've got to figure out what that means for you and your operation. And, a lot of these technologies and practices fit on any size farm or can be adapted to do so. And that's what we're going to learn, as Jim explained, over time, figuring out what is best for all farms. And it really does vary depending on your size, your design, your geography, your soil type. All those kinds of issues have got to be taken into account. And then a reminder, this is not tomorrow. We do have the 2050 and beyond to see how we're going to do this. Next slide, Kelly. And just, just some key takeaways, just remembering back to why we're doing this. And, the pressure is there. The demands are there for our industry and all of agriculture. That's not going away. I don't think it's going to get better. In fact, I see more awareness, more education, more questions being asked from consumers about where their food comes from and how it's produced. And we do want to make sure that we're defining ourselves as dairy and not letting others who don't understand our industry tell our story. So I think that NCI is going to make it easier for farmers and farms to expand their environmental sustainability by making it more economical. And Jim talked a little bit about that, how we're going to do that. We're also, able to document what we are doing and being able to tell that story, being able to help understand how dairy fits into this ongoing debate and deliberations and demands. We really want to make sure that we have the metrics, we have the data, we're able to talk about dairy with confidence and bring others to the table who want to work with us and help farmers be able to afford to participate in these initiatives. So with that, Kelly, I think that we're ready for to hear from those who are in the audience if they have questions or comments for me or Jim.
So yes, if you have questions, please go ahead and either type them in the chat box, or you could unmute and go ahead and ask Jim or Krysta your questions. We have about 5 minutes here to take questions of both of them.
Jim, on the farms that are your cooperator herds, could you give us, from what size to what size information?
Yeah, absolutely. So in just to be clear, the question I'm answering relates to the Foundation for Food and Ag Research Feed Production Grant Program, I think is what you're asking. Is that fair?
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct.
Yeah, so of those 5 operating dairy farms, they will range in size from 200 cows to 15,000 cows on the largest end of the spectrum.
Is there any other questions for either Jim or Krysta at this time? I see we have one here in the chat box asking if there are specific feed products, waste byproducts, and appropriated technologies that NZI is promoting now this year.
So I'll do my best, and maybe there might be a follow-up to this if I'm not hitting what the person is asking here. But as far as waste byproducts, I think that's a really interesting and important facet of how we think about the dairy farm and its environmental footprint. And it's a piece that we are very closely looking at this year, with the thinking that if those byproducts were otherwise being managed in, let's say, a landfill, and we can bring those on farm, which we do in many cases, right? That's very, very common. Number one, we have a very good story to tell. But as part of the Net Zero Initiative this year, one of the things we want to focus on is going beyond that story and getting into the math, sort of an LCA-based approach to better understand how we could take credit from a GHG perspective for that differential between an outcome such as a landfill versus input for production of a nutritious product on farm. So please follow up if there's more to that you'd like to explore on that question.
Are there any other questions for Jim or Krysta?
Jim, would you be able to speak a little bit about the economic side of what's going to be monitored for some long-term measures on all areas? Obviously, adding technology to farms adds an ongoing maintenance cost, and those types of economics can become very burdensome outside of the capital investment. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yes, absolutely. And that really is part of the Dairy Scale for Good piece. And again, the Dairy Scale for Good program, 3 to 5 dairies, all of the necessary practices and technologies, or a suite of practices and technologies necessary to achieve net zero. And those will be, and I use the term living laboratories, those will be like living laboratories. And we will be able to very closely monitor and track all facets of the environmental footprint piece of it, but also the economic side of it, because you're absolutely right. When we start looking at adopting practices and to a much larger extent technologies, there are these additional operational expenses that come with those technologies in an ongoing annual basis. And that will be an important piece of what we monitor and measure and compare and offset that against the benefits. So we're going to be quantifying the benefits and then comparing those with the cost as a part of that multi-year Dairy Scale for Good program.
Okay, we have time for one more question for Jim and Krysta. Anyone?
Christy, while we're waiting for a question, I would just like to add on the economics. I think that's a part that most farmers and economists and others ask us the most about. What is this going to mean? And we also want to make sure that, other than the FAR grant, that folks are aware that we're raising outside dollars to leverage farmer dollars as we look at these issues and try to find these answers. And Nestle, Starbucks are 2 already who are joining us in multi-year efforts into the millions of dollars to help us do research, to help us collect data, help us to figure out what this means on a dairy farm. So we do recognize that these questions are very vital to the success of this initiative and reaching these goals. But we also want to make sure that folks realize we need partners, outside partners, to help with the research, help support and invest as we go down this road looking to find the answers. So just want to make sure we didn't stress that as much as we should have today.
And I see one more question here. And that is, how are farmers and vendors able to pitch potentially profitable products and adaptations to NZI and or other government-funded researchers?
So I would love to hear from farmers and vendors with thoughts and ideas about products and adaptations that could and should be integrated into NZI. I think it's super important, and we're always very open about this, that this is a industry-wide initiative, and any sort of insights that can be shared by the broader dairy industry are always welcome. So from a technical perspective, if any of you out there have thoughts and ideas that you'd like to sort of integrate into the thinking and share, please reach out directly to me. I'd love to talk with you and hear about those ideas and contemplate how we could integrate those into our broader thinking.
Okay, well, that is going to wrap up our questions right now for Jim and Krysta. So I very much appreciate the both of them taking time out of their busy schedules here to join us today.